Greetings to all of the participants in this very important conference. I think there is no more important activity for us than the pursuit of peace. As we speak, we know that Ukraine is suffering, and tens or hundreds of thousands of people will die in the coming weeks and months if the war continues on its current trajectory. Indeed, the whole world is at threat because this war could escalate to a nuclear war between the United States and Russia. Have no doubt that we are on a continuing path of escalation. Peace through negotiation is not only possible, but it was nearly achieved, though, alas, our mainstream media in the US and Europe don't report basic facts anymore. Peace through negotiation was almost achieved in March 2022, just after Russia's invasion. Because in March 2022, the Ukrainian government and the Russian government exchanged documents and negotiated an agreement with the mediation of the government of Turkey and the informal mediation of then Prime Minister Naftali Bennett of Israel. This agreement was nearly reached and signed, and though you cannot find it in the press, the United States stopped the negotiations. It's very important to understand that. It's very hard to understand that through the wall of falsehoods and the wall of deception that surrounds this whole war in the West. The United States has not wanted a negotiated end to the war. And if we return from March 2022 to 3 months earlier, a negotiated settlement before the war was absolutely possible, again, not reported in our media. On December 17, 2021, President Vladimir Putin put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement. At the core of that agreement was that NATO would not enlarge to Ukraine and to the 2,000-kilometer border of Russia. This was not only a concession that the United States should have made to avoid war. It was in America's interest, in Ukraine's interest, in Russia's interest, and in the world's interest. The idea that the United States should push its military alliance, its weapon systems, its bases up to the Russian border is mind-boggling in its recklessness. President Putin put a proposal on the table. I called the White House soon afterwards and beseeched the White House to negotiate on that basis. I explained to the White House how would the United States feel if Russia had bases in Mexico or China had bases in Mexico. The last time that was tried, the United States invaded the said country, which was Cuba, 60 years ago. The White House told me the U.S. will not negotiate with Russia over the enlargement of NATO. I said there will be war if there is not proper diplomacy. The White House did not want to avoid this war through diplomacy. It either thought that it could call the bluff of President Putin, or have the war and accomplish what our defense secretary, better to say our war secretary, Lloyd Austin, publicly stated, and that is that the goal of this war is to weaken Russia. If the Ukrainians die and if Ukraine is destroyed in the middle, that's what a proxy war is. All my life, 68 years, I have witnessed U.S. proxy wars in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cambodia, in Nicaragua, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya, and now in Ukraine. The United States is not thinking about Ukraine. It's thinking about weakening its adversary, or its perceived adversary, Russia. So diplomacy was stopped by the United States in March 2022. It was rejected by the United States in December 2021, and it was rejected by the United States between 2014 and 2021, because when the Minsk I agreement and Minsk II agreements were signed, the United States supported the government of Ukraine to not honor the agreement that Ukraine had signed. The purpose of the Minsk II agreements was to ensure the language and cultural rights of the people of the Donbass, or eastern Ukraine, overwhelmingly Russian ethnicity, with a system of autonomy, which the government of Ukraine agreed to, and in which France and Germany were to be the guarantors, and in which the entire UN Security Council unanimously backed. And the Ukraine government said, no, we don't want to implement what we have signed. The United States said, fine, we will send you arms. You don't have to implement that, even though the UN Security Council had signed. So, in fact, the rejection of diplomacy goes back to late 2014 and early 2015. But in fact, the U.S. rejection of diplomacy goes back even further. It goes back to February 2014, because in February 2014, again, never explored in our mainstream media, but obvious to anybody paying attention, the United States conspired to overthrow the government of Viktor Yanukovych, who was pursuing the path of neutrality in Ukraine. And if that sounds shocking, please go back and listen to the conversation between the then Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, and the then U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat, which took place 3 weeks before the violent overthrow of the Yanukovych regime. In that call, Victoria Nuland described who would be the post-Yanukovych government. Again, I'm 68 years old. I have lived through dozens of U.S. regime change operations all over the world. I've seen some with my own eyes. And this one I saw very close up. And of course, there was a violent insurrection 3 weeks after the intercepted call, and the government that was brought into place was exactly the one that Victoria Nuland, as Assistant Secretary of State, had described on the call to the U.S. ambassador. I was in Kiev soon afterwards. I learned firsthand how U.S. funding from so-called NGOs had paid for a lot of the so-called Maidan revolution. This was the trigger of the war that really started 9 years ago. Again, it was a rejection of diplomacy by the United States because the sitting president of Ukraine wanted neutrality, whereas the U.S. government wanted NATO enlargement. That means that this conflict actually dates back even earlier to 2008. We can go, because in 2008, George Bush put on the table that NATO would enlarge to Ukraine and to Georgia. If you look at a map, the U.S. plan is absolutely clear and follows a line that had been spelled out a decade earlier by Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security advisor to Carter and one of the leading U.S. geostrategists. The idea was to encircle Russia in the Black Sea region, because with Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO, Russia would be encircled by Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia in the Black Sea. The idea, clearly stated, was to bottle up Russia so that Russia was no longer any problem to U.S. policy. Where did the U.S. want a free hand? It wanted to be able to replace governments at will in the Middle East. For example, overthrowing Saddam Hussein in 2003, overthrowing Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, a NATO exercise, by the way, not just a U.S. exercise, but a NATO exercise, overthrowing Bashar al-Assad in 2011. This is another point that's misunderstood. Bashar al-Assad and the so-called Syrian civil war is a U.S. regime change operation gone terribly wrong. The idea was that the CIA would work with the regional governments to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. It failed. Several years later, Russia came to the assistance of its ally, and then our media pointed the finger at Russian intervention, ignoring the U.S. intervention beforehand. There has been almost no reporting about the basic fact of Operation Timber Sycamore, which was an order by President Obama that the CIA would overthrow Bashar al-Assad. I know a lot of this also directly from people who were absolutely involved and trying to stop the war, but the United States opposed diplomacy. We can keep winding the clock back to truly understand what this is about. The U.S. at every stage has rejected diplomacy, and it goes back to actually 1990. In 1990, incidentally, I was an economic advisor to President Mikhail Gorbachev's economic team. Gorbachev wanted peace in Europe. He wanted a common European home. At that time, the United States and Germany promised explicitly that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. That was a lie and a phony promise. Gorbachev disbanded the Soviet-led military alliance, Germany reunified, and by 1992, the United States was already planning the massive expansion of NATO all the way to Ukraine. Historians are finding in the archives that the plan to expand NATO all the way to Ukraine dates back to 1992. Incidentally, Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote in 1997 in Foreign Affairs a very clear article that lays out the explicit timeline for NATO enlargement, saying that between 2005 and 2010, Ukraine would join NATO. And of course, the invitation pushed by the United States came in 2008, just on Brzezinski's timeline. And note, this is well before Putin. This is well before any supposed threats coming from Russia. This was U.S. military expansion planned for 3 decades now, and nothing is to stop it. Not diplomacy, not negotiation, not avoidance of war, not any truth-telling in the newspapers. And while the Standard may call this a propaganda event, I would welcome a public discussion with the editor of the Standard at any moment to discuss these issues. Because these are facts. This is the history. This is not what's reported in our mainstream media now. Our mainstream media makes a false narrative that this war started with a, quote, unprovoked invasion on February 24th, 2022 by Putin. That is the official Western narrative. The New York Times has repeated that claim 26 times in its editorials and its op-eds, but it never allows anyone to tell the real history in the pages to the readership. And this is what's happening all over the US and all over Europe. We're talking to ourselves. We are leading to the destruction of Ukraine because there is no way in the world to have a military victory over Russia with NATO enlargement as the end result, because Russia will continue to escalate as needed. Perhaps Russia will simply defeat Ukraine on the battlefield. That is quite possible. But if not, Russia will escalate. And Russia has 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons. President Obama, though he contributed to this overthrow of Yanukovych, was also very clear in 2014, do not get into a war over this issue, because as he put it then, Russia has escalatory dominance, meaning they can always raise the stakes up to and including nuclear war. We are on a reckless path based on falsehoods. This war could have been avoided at countless stages in the last 30 years. This war should never have broken out 9 years ago, because the United States should never be part of violent overthrows of other governments, but it's a bad habit of the United States. Europe should have enforced the Minsk II agreements, backed by the UN Security Council, signed by Ukraine, instead of ignoring them, laughing at them. But the United States said, no, you don't have to follow those. We will arm you. The United States should have negotiated at the end of 2021. The United States should have applauded rather than stopped the negotiations in March 2022. So till today, there is a negotiating path that has been on the table. At the core is neutrality of Ukraine to keep the two nuclear superpowers away from each other. It's common sense. It is what the United States has demanded for 2 centuries in the Western Hemisphere. If the U.S. neoconservatives were not so arrogant, reckless, and blind, it would have been agreed a long time ago. Till this moment, it is possible. NATO, however, which is a U.S. military alliance, insists that no third country, that is Russia or anybody else, has any right to have any say to where the U.S. military alliance goes. That is reckless, and it leads to war. And now have no doubt about the U.S. irresponsibility, which is trying to place NATO offices in Asia. I think not even remembering that it's not the North Asia Treaty Organization, it is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is not an expeditionary force for U.S. hegemony. It was meant to defend Western Europe against the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. And yet the United States is trying to expand NATO now to Asia to fight China. Europeans are aghast, but the media are not explaining what this is about. And they are certainly not telling the truth that the war in Ukraine is a disaster that came from the unrelenting arrogance of the United States to keep pushing, provoking, and to avoiding every possibility of a diplomatic off-ramp. So let us help people to understand that negotiations till this moment are feasible, and that President Biden needs to step forward and say NATO will stop its enlargement if Russia leaves and ends the fighting. And this will be the basis for peace. Let me close by noting that today exactly is the 60th anniversary of the greatest speech by any U.S. president on peace, John F. Kennedy's peace speech, given June 10, 1963, at the height of the Cold War. And what President Kennedy said is precisely relevant to us today. At the height of the Cold War, he had the clarity, the honesty, the eloquence, and the leadership to say that the Soviet Union did not want war. The United States does not want war. We can negotiate peace. And President Kennedy called on Americans to reconsider their attitudes to the Cold War and to the Soviet Union. President Kennedy said we should hail the Russian people for their vast achievements in science and industry and culture. At the height of the Cold War, he dared to say this. He knew that the military-industrial complex opposed him. He knew the generals resented a peace initiative, but the American people overwhelmingly supported it. And 5 weeks after President Kennedy's brilliant speech, which everybody can listen to online, Kennedy and Khrushchev signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And President Kennedy made a campaign in the United States over the heads of the military-industrial complex to speak directly to the American people that peace is possible, that the U.S. and the Soviet Union have a mutual interest in peace, that an agreement on peace will be in the interest of both sides and enforced by both sides. And President Kennedy carried the day when the Senate voted 80-19 to ratify the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. That is leadership. That is an expression of the true common good. That is what is possible today. Thank you very much. I think one thing people should keep their eye on is the doomsday clock kept by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which has been pushed to 90 seconds to midnight, which I regard as an accurate representation of how close we are to nuclear Armageddon. The clock is the closest that it has ever been since the start of the doomsday clock in 1947. We are absolutely pushing towards nuclear war in Ukraine. Russia, of course, has 1,700 deployed nuclear weapons, or 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons, and thousands more tactical nuclear weapons. That's the strategic count. The U.S., the same. We are told daily by these geniuses in the Pentagon and in the military-industrial complex, don't worry about it. Don't be blackmailed about nuclear risks. It's unbelievable to be told that, because anybody that knows the history of the nuclear age knows how close we have come to nuclear war on several occasions, and how many generals in the United States have urged nuclear attack. One of the reasons for the absolutely ardent, to the point of war, opposition of Russia to NATO enlargement is the prospect of missiles minutes away from Russian territory. Part of this risk goes back to 2002, when the United States unilaterally abandoned the ABM treaty. This was a devastating blow to the nuclear framework and to peace. And it was one of the key steps on the way to war in Ukraine, because not only did the U.S. abandon the ABM treaty, but it positioned Aegis missiles in Poland and Romania. And Russia made the very good point: we don't know what you're putting down those missile silos, but they can reach us in minutes. And this has been one of the top points emphasized by Russia all along. Then the United States, of course, under Trump, abandoned the INF treaty and has embarked on a multi-trillion-dollar upgrade, so-called, of our nuclear arsenal. So the U.S. plays with this, and it tells us, don't be worried. It's terrifying, and of course be worried. Once in 2022, in the fall, Biden blurted out, or he didn't blurt out, he was caught on camera in a fundraiser in California that we're on a path to nuclear Armageddon. And you know what the response of the media was the next day? To chastise the president for saying this. He was attacked. How dare a president worry the American people this way? Well, that was the last we heard of it. His political advisors in the White House no doubt lectured our president, don't ever worry the American people this way again. So if you're not worried, you should be terrified. If I could add a word also, there were two unipolar moments in the world after World War II. The first was immediately after World War II, when the United States stood almost alone, untouched, or nearly untouched by physical war, and with a booming and technologically leading, even dominant industrial sector, and as the sole holder of atomic weapons, very briefly. And the U.S. created many institutions at the time that were partly multilateral and partly U.S.-led and based, like the Bretton Woods institutions. The second unipolar moment was at the end of 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. China was still a very, very poor country. The Soviet Union lay in ruins, and the United States neoconservatives, Cheney, Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, in the final year of the Bush senior administration, created the concept of how the U.S. would preserve its unipolarity. But these were moments, as Professor Moon just said, because today the economic reality is we're already in a multipolar world. The BRICS countries are a larger share of the world economy than the G7 if measured at international prices, that is purchasing power, parity adjusted GDP. This is momentous. We will not have a bipolar world because there are other poles of the world. India is behind China in its catching up process by 15 years perhaps, or 20 years, but it's now advancing strongly. It's even more populous than China and will become much more populous than China as China's population peaks, ages, and India's continues to grow for several decades more. Africa will be a pole of the world society in the coming decades because the African countries are figuring out that the imperial powers left them as 55 divided small nations, but they are unifying in the African Union. The list goes on. I think the kind of world practically that will evolve should evolve, is a UN charter-based world with suitable reforms, strong regional groupings like RCEP that end Cold War outdated divisions, and a lot of international relations among major regions, Europe, Russia and Central Asia, RCEP, South Asia, African Union, a UNISUR group of South America, and so forth. So multilateralism and regionalism on an economic basis, because creating a zero carbon energy system, bringing Australia's sunshine by submarine cable to ASEAN, integrating in the Asia Pacific region on a new green infrastructure and industry is a regional scale effort. So this world already exists, except at the Council of Foreign Relations and in the minds of the U.S. security establishment. We're already past the unipolar moment. It's just that the United States doesn't know it and doesn't accept it.
I can tell you, I headed an institute at Columbia University, the Earth Institute, for 14 years with hundreds of climate scientists. It was a terrifying job because every week a colleague would come up to me and say, Jeff, it's worse than we thought. And the great climate scientist, my colleague James Hansen, has been telling me and telling the world for years, not only are we warming at an alarming and unsustainable rate, but the warming itself is accelerating. And he has been saying for years that even during the La Nina phase of the Pacific, which cools the planet, we continued to warm. In other words, the underlying warming was so great that even the La Ninas didn't stop the warming process. But he kept saying to me and saying to the world, wait till we go to an El Nino. Boom. Now we're in an El Nino and the temperatures are jumping. We're setting records. We could hit and exceed that 1.5 degrees Celsius level within the next 3, 4, 5 years. That was supposed to be the absolute ceiling. Now, the what to do has been known for a long time, which is to move from the coal, oil, and gas economy to one based on wind, solar, geothermal, hydropower, nuclear, and others that don't burn carbon. And this has been understood, to move to electric vehicles, to move to heating our buildings with the electricity rather than heating oil, and so on. But we have to do it, and we have to do it at a global scale. And Congress has dragged its feet because of the big oil lobby, really corruption basically, for years and years and years, paying these campaigns of our congressmen and so forth. And the United States has been one of the foot draggers in this process, shockingly.
Right, and some would argue, though, that it isn't just the United States and that you have to include, you are someone who said we must include places like China or India, but I want to get down to something
Absolutely.
that you've really drilled down on in the last few years, and that's the fact that countries need to commit to what you call decarbonizing the energy system. How does that work in economic reality today? We know what the problem is, we've heard it, and we can feel it, so many of us when we go outside. What can we do today?
Yeah, here's the interesting thing. Today, we can only take these steps that are needed. Now, what are they? They're very straightforward. To shift from producing our electricity with coal or oil or natural gas to producing it with wind, solar, hydro, and so forth. To electrify our vehicles, to electrify the heating and cooking in buildings, to electrify the parts of industry that can be electrified, and to use hydrogen produced with clean electricity for the parts that can't be electrified directly. Now, this is all known. We need a plan, a game plan, and we need to finance this. Now, here's the interesting thing about the costs. The costs are higher up front, but lower down the road, because if you go to solar, you don't pay for fuel down the road. So a higher capital cost, but a lower operating cost, a lower zero fuel cost. The fuel comes automatically from the sunshine. And so it turns out, if you have reasonable financing, it's not even more expensive over the time of a long-term project. The problem has been the lobbying, the misunderstandings, the misinformation, and the fact that our government's so much more interested in fighting wars or in having conflicts with China rather than sitting down and properly discussing how are we going to save the planet together. Right. And that's what we really need to do.
Now, and understood, you have also pointed out that the Inflation Reduction Act doesn't go far enough in terms of meeting those goals. But also, studies have singled out here the impact on productivity, agricultural output, of course, human health, that we've had, thousands of deaths due to climate change each and every year. Where do you see this going, especially when it comes to the industrialized economies versus the developing economies? Because you know that the developing economies are looking at us going, why is this our problem? We should be compensated for what you have already done to the planet.
Well, first of all, the alarm bells are ringing. I zoomed into a 6th grade class in Brooklyn last week to talk to them about these issues. The kids are wearing masks because of the forest fires in Canada. It's just tragic. Can't we protect our children? This is the first point. Second, we need to get the financing to enable the poorer countries to be able to do what needs to be done. They're ready to do it, actually. What they're saying is, fine, make sure we can finance this on the same terms that the rich countries can. We're ready to do it because we're suffering otherwise. It's 120 degrees in North Africa. They're not resisting movement on this. It's same in India, disaster. But they're saying create a system of finance. That depends on the U.S. Congress. Vote some money for the World Bank so the World Bank can make a long-term loan to a developing country so that it can have the capital that it needs to make the investment in wind or solar. It's really not so complicated, but we have to get beyond the oil lobby in the United States, the corruption of the Congress in the United States. We have to get to real practical solutions.
Right. So the Western perception is that Putin brought war, bloc thinking, and arms race back to Europe. But it seems that the West is more than willing to accept this Putin's reality as a new norm. We have this keyword Zeitenwende. So it seems to be an agreement that they meet on a much lower level. The higher values like multilateralism, interdependence, arms control, they're all given up also by the West. So it seems that Putin won this narrative. Now we're in a different world. Whoever is responsible, but everybody plays the same game.
The very sad thing for me
in watching this is how Europe lost its identity as a political union to become part of NATO. It's something ununderstandable for me, the equation of the EU and NATO. And the fact that President von der Leyen is campaigning to leave the presidency of the European Commission to become head of NATO is an example of how utterly bizarre the situation is. So I'm a professor of sustainable development, and that means that I study not only income levels, but quality of life, health, and many other dimensions of life. I also publish as a co-editor, founding co-editor of an annual report called the World Happiness Report, which uses data collected by Gallup International to assess the subjective assessment of life in more than 150 countries. The reason I mention all of this is Europe has by far the highest living standards on the planet, by far, the highest quality of life, by far, and is most attuned of any region in the world to reducing inequalities, to green transformation, to doing the things we should be doing in the 21st century. That's Europe's vocation, a continent of peace, sustainable development, social equity. That's the genius of the OSCE, that Europe extends all the way to the Urals. I was advisor to President Gorbachev. I knew President Gorbachev. He believed in a common European home, not as some pernicious gimmick, because he really believed in it. And he was a great man of peace, probably the greatest statesman of our age. And the United States could not understand him. They could not take yes for an answer. He's offering peace. What's the trick? He's offering peace. Oh, I get it. We'll be the unipolar world. He's offering to disband the militaries. I get it. We'll extend NATO all the way to the Caucasus. That's the U.S. reaction to the greatest opportunity we had for peace. Europe is losing its greatest achievements in this. Europe is not the junior partner of the global hegemon. Europe doesn't even have the same values as the United States. That's, by the way, literally, objectively so. We're part of the crazy Anglo-Saxon world. We're still with John Locke's libertarianism. We're still with, you don't have to help the poor, they're a burden on society. We have ideas that go back to 17th century Britain, and then we learned from 19th century Britain what global empire means, and decided that that's what our vocation was. Europe is so much better than what it is signing up for right now. This is extremely sad and extremely dangerous. By the way, I understand Poland's sentiments. I was their main economic advisor. I helped them cancel their debts in 1990 and 91. I helped them stabilize their economy. I was their biggest champion for becoming members of the European Union. By the way, it wasn't even the Union then. It was the European Community when I started the campaign. I wrote their first reform program, and I was told that the theme is the return to Europe. That's the instruction I was given by Lech Wałęsa's team. You write a plan for the economic return to Europe. So I've seen all of this. I can understand their Russophobia. I don't accept it as geopolitics or as clever or as an answer. I certainly understand it. My wife was born in communist Czechoslovakia. I have no illusions about the hard attitudes, but we have to think about how we're actually going to have a safe planet. This isn't about sentiment only. It's about some knowledge of history, some ability to see the other point of view, to understand the history, even to understand the history of the Cold War. This country, as I emphasized, is a great lesson that is completely ignored, by the way, as all the neutral states other than Austria abandon their neutrality with such enthusiasm. Big mistake. But my point is, please, Europe is not NATO. Europe is not NATO. And if you knew how crazy it is on the other side of the Atlantic, I'm trying to tell you, they think that their biggest important calling in the world is confrontation with China. Is that what you want to sign up for right now? Don't. Don't do it. You have the best living standards and the best values, I would say. Social democratic values, which even for the non-social democratic parties permeate the idea that people should be taken care of, that there should be social housing, that there should be public. We don't have universal health coverage. You sign up for those values? I wouldn't recommend it. We don't have public values. We have British laissez-faire Lockean libertarian values. I don't recommend it. By the way, it doesn't work very well. I live in an expensive neighborhood in New York that is absolutely filled with beggars, filled with garbage that is not taken care of because the public spaces don't work, and now filled with shootings. Don't do it. And that is an approach that is part of this, even as we're falling apart internally, because we have a mass shooting almost every day, it seems. Sometimes more. Even as this is happening, we're all about war. And when we just had our debt negotiations, you know what the bipartisan agreement was? That the social spending is capped, but the military spending is allowed to rise. Even though we're spending 3 times more than China, and even though we are spending more than the next 10 countries in the world combined, and even though we have 800 military bases overseas around the world. Don't sign up for that. Europe is different from NATO. No consequence. That's what the U.S. thought. The U.S. has overthrown dozens of governments. It's really a bad habit. They forgot diplomacy. What they learned, they think, learned it from the British, by the way, that if you don't like your counterpart, overthrow them. So you forget that there's diplomacy. You don't have to deal with them, you have to subvert them. So they thought that they could overthrow Yanukovych, no consequence. Putin grabbed Crimea like he told George Bush he would. Okay? And the Russian parts of the Ukrainian army broke away in eastern Ukraine, took the weapons with them, and started this, the people's republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. And by the way, OSCE observers and NATO observers say this was not Russian weapons coming in. I wasn't there. It said this was Ukrainian weapons taken from within the Ukrainian army to create these two breakaway regions. That led to the Minsk agreements. Putin thought maybe that will be the way that this will stop. There will be autonomy for these two regions. Crimea will be ours. That would have probably stopped this war. But Minsk wasn't honored. When President Biden came in, Putin said, stop, stop. And Biden said, no, why stop? Ukraine's going to become a member of NATO. And during 2021, the United States 3 times signed very high-level documents committing the U.S. to NATO enlargement to Ukraine. On December, and then Putin massed troops on the border and put forward this draft document on December 17th. He thought, I think that would lead to negotiations. I called the White House 2 weeks after that, spoke to a senior official at length. I said, negotiate, avoid a war, negotiate. It's not even a concession not to expand NATO. It's common sense not to expand NATO. And I was told, no, we'll never negotiate over that. So Putin thought that that would work. It failed. So he launched the invasion on February 24th. What was he expecting then? My view is he was expecting a quick negotiation. Why do I surmise that? Because 3 weeks later, there was a quick negotiation. 3 weeks later, Zelensky said, we don't have to be part of NATO. We can be neutral. Go look it up, ladies and gentlemen. That was Putin's idea. Okay, we've shown we mean business. Now we'll have a negotiated outcome based on neutrality. But the U.S. called that bluff, said, no way. We tell our client, you don't negotiate, which is exactly what happened. So they called the bluff. And that, with sanctions and us doubling down, Putin will back off. No, Putin mobilized in the summer of 2021, 300,000 more people. He called the bluff. Okay, we'll send tanks and F-16s. We'll call the bluff. Come on. All of us have been in 6th grade. That's what we're witnessing. Except they're playing with nuclear weapons. This is clear. By the way, not only clear, at least to me, I said exactly this to U.S. officials all through this process, because for a while they would even talk to me. Because I know them. I've been around. And I said, this is deep for Russia. And by the way, all of our best diplomats have said the same thing for 30 years. William Burns, who's very bright and now CIA director, in 2008 was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. He sent a famous memo. The memo is called Niet, means Niet. He explained that the entire Russian political class is dead set against NATO enlargement to Ukraine. Niet means Niet. And he said it's no joke. But of course, American politicians don't listen to this. Bill Perry, our defense secretary, said, don't expand NATO. George Kennan said in 1997, that this is going to lead to disaster. You can look it up in the New York Times. It's on the website. This is all predictable. They behave like kids. Raytheon lobbies for more sales. all the think tanks in Washington are gung-ho for U.S. unilateral prerogatives. Every article in Foreign Affairs magazine is about what they call U.S. primacy. So it's all about how can we stay number one. As an economist, it's not even a question I ask, by the way. The question an economist asks is how can we have a win-win economy of trade? But if you're a strategist, it's who's on top. That's what counts. To me, it's back to 6th grade. But for them, each side's calling each other's bluff. So where's the miscalculation? Both sides. The only absolute disastrous loser is Ukraine in this. And Ukraine had one president who was trying delicately to avoid being engulfed in a proxy war, and that was Yanukovych, and he was overthrown.
I have a couple of more questions before we move on to the Q&A questions, 3 more questions about. Just to respond, of course, the Western perception is different.
Well, I agree with all of it. Instead of the word obsessive, I would probably say relentless, because it has been the driver of U.S. foreign policy since 1992. The idea that there's a unipolar world, and now the U.S. is going to run everything with the demise of the Soviet Union. And so I think that this was really planned step by step, and it's all gone absolutely disastrously, because these people are not very clever, by the way. They really are not very clever. They have no sense of proportion and what they're doing. And of course, they denigrated Russia's capacity to respond to anything that the United States put up. So they got everything wrong relentlessly, but they have created exactly the formula to destroy Ukraine. This is the formula that says there's no path to peace, because we will do, the West will do exactly what Russia will fight to the end for, because it's an existential position for Russia, and that is not having NATO on its 2,000-kilometer border by being positioned in Ukraine. So this has been such a shit show. I don't know if we're allowed to say that on the air, but it's unbelievable. Trying to understand why is, I think it was basically a consistent underestimation of what Russia would do at every stage. So this was kind of the neocons, by their own bluster and blather and arrogance and ignorance, thinking that they could do whatever they wanted without any opposition, and President Putin called their bluff. And now they went to Vilnius without an idea in their heads about how to end this war. But what's stunning, what we're going to see, actually, since this is not going to be settled at the negotiating table in the coming weeks or months, this is obvious. The simple truth seems to be the one that Jake Sullivan and Biden said a few weeks ago, and that's the U.S. has run out of ammunition to give to Ukraine. And if that's the case, which is what the U.S. has said, well, it's just going to have an absolutely disastrous outcome for Ukraine. But Vilnius was without a single constructive idea, without any impulse whatsoever to actually help save Ukraine. They don't care. And I think another part of this, obviously, is that from the U.S. security establishment calculation, what does it matter how many more thousands or tens of thousands of people die? That's never been their calculation, as long as it's not U.S. body bags. And this is part of the profound cynicism of all of this. Not an idea, not a constructive approach, not a word about peace or negotiation or discussion, nothing except a formula guaranteed to be more disaster.
Absolutely. Can I just ask you one particular point which stood out for me about your article, which is something I didn't know, that in 1992, it seems that there were private discussions within the Bush administration about how to expand NATO eastwards. This is at the very time that, well, shortly after the time when the Russians were told that wasn't going to happen. It's also the time when people like yourself were preparing to go to Russia to work to find ways of changing Russia in some ways, integrating it with the West, building up the relationship between Russia and the West. And you've spoken on our programs about how you would telephone people in the White House and in the administrations, the various administrations, saying, can I get help to do this in Russia, which has worked in Poland, and it wasn't happening? Do you think there's a linkage with this?
Oh, no, it's the same story. It's not a linkage. It is exactly the same story. I didn't understand it at the time. I actually, got engaged heavily with Russia in 1990, with Soviet Union when Grigory Yavlinsky was the economic advisor to Gorbachev, and he asked me for help and some suggestions because what I had suggested for Poland, debt cancellation, emergency stabilization funding. I invented something called the Zloty Stabilization Fund, a currency stabilization fund. And just to give you an idea of what geopolitics was like, I know a lot about currency stabilization. That was my specialty. So I was helping Poland in its new government, the Mazowiecki government. And I had the idea literally one morning, it was the IMF meetings in September 1989. And I said, Poland needs a stabilization fund for its currency now that it's going to be making market reforms. And so I typed up a page of what a stabilization fund is from economic history. And I called Senator Robert Dole, who was the Senate Majority Leader. First, I called the Polish finance minister, who was in Washington in his first days ever as finance minister, and he was at the IMF meetings in Washington. And I said, Leszek, could I try to get you $1 billion today? And he said, oh, yeah, of course, if you can do that, fine. So I called up the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Dole, and I said, could I come in, Senator? And he knew that I was advising Poland, so he brought me in, and I explained to him, this is what Poland really needs to avoid a hyperinflation. And he said, could you come back in an hour? And so I came back in an hour, and who was there? The National Security Advisor sitting in Senator Dole's office, General Scowcroft. And Senator Dole said, Mr. Sachs, could you explain to General Scowcroft your idea? So I handed him the page. I explained what currency stabilization is, how this was part of Keynes's insight from 1919 and why this was what Poland needed. And General Scowcroft said, well, we'll take a look at it. And Senator Dole said, call me at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, 5 p.m., I called Senator's office and he said, Jeff, tell your friends that they've got their $1 billion. So that was one day, that was 8 hours. I thought, pretty damn good economist, that's really persuasive. And I had many other ideas, canceling Poland's debts and so forth. Basically, they were accepted, all of them. I thought, this is pretty good. This is how you're supposed to do stabilization. Poland stabilized, had a stable currency. After the collapse of the Eastern trade, Poland started growth in the middle of 1990 and then had 30 years of growth. Now, the Soviet Union, I should say Yavlinsky, was watching this. So he called, said, could I meet you in Warsaw? And we met, got to know each other a little bit. And I said, I'd be happy to help Gorbachev, whom I admired tremendously, by the way. I know many people do not and see the economic collapse and the collapse of the Soviet Union and all the rest. But Gorbachev was a man of peace and a man of incredible decency. And he wanted a common European home. And I loved the idea, and I got stuck with that idea, I have to say, for the next 33 years, because that's what we really need, not the barriers. So I said I would try to help President Gorbachev. We actually had a project at Harvard and MIT in the spring of 1991 to come up with a plan. I wrote a central part of it based on what Poland had done, which was stabilize its currency, avoid a hyperinflation, get its debts canceled, get a fresh start, begin economic growth. And the White House turned it down flat, immediately. And by the way, I wasn't the only person in this group. This was Graham Allison, who was dean of the Harvard Kennedy School at the time, Robert Blackwell, who became very major figure in U.S. foreign policy, Stanley Fischer, who became many things, including vice president of the Fed, governor of the Israeli Central Bank, chief economist of the World Bank. It wasn't some bizarre group. It was pretty damn establishment, and we were saying help the Soviet Union avoid a financial collapse. Okay, zero. The White House said, basically ridiculous. We're not going to help the Soviet Union, whether it's Gorbachev or not. Gorbachev fell. Gaidar, who was Yeltsin's economic advisor, called me in the fall, said, please come to the dacha outside of Moscow. We urgently need to talk about the financial situation. So I came in September 89. This is now September 91, and met with Gaidar. And interestingly, just as an example, the G7 finance deputies were coming to Moscow in November. And I know a lot about that. So I said to Yegor Gaidar, who's a wonderful person, tell them you need a standstill on debt payments. You're running out of reserves. Before everything explodes, you need a standstill. So I was with him in the room as the G7 deputies came in. Then he went into the room and I stayed on the outside. The meeting broke and he came out ashen-faced and said, Yegor, what happened? He said, they told me if we don't pay every dollar on time, we stop all aid immediately. The food shipments on the high seas, you pay every penny that's due. And Russia ran out of foreign exchange reserves in the first days of 1992. Now, if you have experience in finance, that means that's how hyperinflation starts. I went back to the White House and said, are you kidding? I went to the IMF. Look what Poland did. Nothing. I went to the Secretary of State, who said to me, Mr. Sachs, even if I agree with you, I just want to tell you, it's not going to happen. You're not going to get the aid. I was, of course, nonplussed. Russia was not exactly the enemy at that moment. Russia was at the end of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin said, we're done with this Soviet period. We want to be normal. And what happens in Washington? Absolute, complete unwillingness to do anything, but interestingly, unwillingness to do anything of the kind that they had just done for Poland. It was very confusing to me, frankly, because it was a little bit like a controlled experiment. I was the same economic advisor, it was the same recommendations, it was the same moment a year later. But what I was observing and did not understand at the time was the Cheney, Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, neocon ascendancy, which was starting. And of course, I didn't realize it was going to become the Biden, Newland, everyone ascendancy. But I was watching something that was completely devoid of economics, completely devoid of just even a scintilla of empathy or understanding that you don't leave a major nuclear power in profound financial crisis, as was happening in 1992. And I was a student of John Maynard Keynes, and especially of what I regard as one of the most important books of the 20th century, The Economics of the Peace, which Keynes wrote in a disgusted mood in 1919 after the Versailles Treaty, saying, "Are you all crazy? You're creating the conditions for the next world war, for the next horror of Europe by having this kind of punitive settlement." And I was trying to tell them as an expert, don't do this. By the way, I was also advisor to Leonid Kuchma. So this is, people say to me every day now, you're a Putin apologist. This was years before President Putin came on the scene, obviously. And I was advisor to the Ukraine government the same way at the same time. They didn't want to help. This was now the U.S. unipolar world. And it was a little hard for me to understand because I was entranced with the idea of a world of peace, rather naive. Why not? Gorbachev had said, from Rotterdam to Vladivostok, this is a common economic home. This is a world of peace. I thought it was a pretty nice idea. And by the way, it was truly, completely within reach. And we just didn't want it for a moment.
And I would add that the funds that would have been needed would not have been hugely high.
They were tiny. This was the whole thing. Tiny. By the way, $1 billion for Poland. Okay, it was nice to get it in an 8-hour turnaround, but this is nothing. But the effect of it in enabling a currency to be stabilized and enabling a coherent economic program to go forward is enormous. It's not, I won't use the joke of economic stabilization because it'll be misunderstood by people. But I've been involved in many stabilizations. There's a little bit of magic involved in creating a framework of expectations, and a little bit of money, well put, well placed at the right moment, goes an enormous distance because it's positively reinforced. And they refuse to do any of that in the case of first Gorbachev's Soviet Union in the last days of perestroika, and then in Yeltsin's new Russia, where Yeltsin said, and I sat across from him, we just want to be normal. We want to be a normal country in a normal time. Please help. I said, Mr. President, no problem. This is the most important development of the 20th century in geopolitics. This is obvious. And it not only was it not obvious, it was completely resisted by the U.S. And I would just add the other thing that, and there's several things that are important to understand how deep the underlying direction is and how persistent it is and how these plans get set and then they get carried out when all the evidence runs the wrong way. You can see all of this forming. I could catch the glimpses of it early on, but then I would really encourage people to read Zbigniew Brzezinski's piece in Foreign Affairs in 1997, I think it's called A Strategy for Eurasia. And he spells out almost precisely the timeline for NATO enlargement, including to Ukraine. This is 1997. Putin's not on the scene. This has nothing to do with Putin. This is no reaction to Putin. This is years, and this is a decade, more than a decade, before the Bucharest NATO summit where the offer is made. And Brzezinski spells out exactly the timeline because these are deep plans. And another thing that people should look at is Wesley Clark, who was the NATO commanding general, because he went into the Pentagon on 2 occasions and came out completely shaken by the neocons who explained to Clark all the wars that the U.S. was going to have to take out all of the governments that had been Soviet or Russian allies, Syria and Iraq and all the rest. This was a plan, long-standing. You don't have to be crazy. Just listen to what these people tell us. The problem is everything else is confidential, hidden, and the government lies nonstop about everything, nonstop. And so you have to be in the room to see it, or you have to know someone who is in the room, or you have to watch very closely to get the drift of this. But, all the people say, oh, it's nothing to do with NATO, blah, 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 blah. They don't know. How could they know? The New York Times has denied it for 20 years in this kind of pablum that the American people have been fed. So they have no data, no information, unless they're watching you guys. That's the basic point.
Actually, the first lie came when the Soviet Union shot down a CIA spy plane, the U-2 spy plane with Gary Powers, just on the eve of what was supposed to be a summit between Eisenhower and Soviet Party Chairman Nikita Khrushchev. And the CIA lies for a living. We know this. But it lied to the President of the United States also, saying, Mr. President, don't worry, they can't shoot down the spy plane. It's too high. And if they do shoot down the spy plane, it's designed to disintegrate. And if it doesn't disintegrate anyway, the pilot is going to take his cyanide pill. There's no way anything can happen to embarrass you. And of course, they shoot down the spy plane. They get the wreckage. They get the pilot alive, Gary Powers. They don't announce that. They say we have been spied upon and downed a plane without revealing those details. And Eisenhower comes out and says, no, this is a weather craft that went off course from Turkey. And then the Soviets reveal, we have the fuselage, we have the pilot who has told us about his spy mission, direct, blatant lies. Then soon after this comes the direct, blatant lies of the Bay of Pigs. It's dangerous. And this is the CIA, by the way, and it's the CIA till today, in my view. It is lying and unaccountable and really never called to task for these lies because the public doesn't know them, doesn't understand what's going on. But from the Soviet U.S. point of view, within months of the Kennedy administration, this air was poisoned. And there was one other thing that was absolutely precipitating all of this, which was, and very fundamental and completely never discussed in America almost at all, but there had been no peace treaty at the end of World War II. And the Cold War emerged, in fact, over a bitter dispute between the Soviet Union and the United States about the future of Germany. The Soviet Union had lost more than 20 million people in the war and did not want to see German remilitarized. The United States, on the other hand, decided that the three occupied regions from the western side, the US, French, and British regions, would form a single new Federal Republic of Germany. The remaining fourth part, the Soviet-occupied part, would become the German Democratic Republic, the GDR. But the western side would become the bulwark of a new military alliance, NATO, and it would be remilitarized. And the Soviet Union said, no, we just lost more than 20 million people. Now, within a few years, you're remilitarizing. Well, of course, the United States never listened, never negotiated, and at the end of the 1950s, took another step. Eisenhower was flirting with the idea, maybe we should just give our allies control over nuclear weapons as well, so we can reduce the U.S. Troops numbers in Europe. Eisenhower was very frugal. He was a fiscal conservative, and he wanted to bring troops home and use the nuclear shield. And so there was, at the end of the 1950s, lots of talk about nuclear sharing. And this was freaking out the Soviet Union also. And the United States doesn't know how to talk to anybody. There's no diplomacy. There are mortal enemies. There's no one to negotiate. And so the situation by the time Kennedy came in was completely fraught. Then came the Bay of Pigs. Then Khrushchev said, okay, we need to teach Americans a bit of their own lessons. We'll put missiles in Cuba. And Khrushchev had a quite remarkable exchange with Andrei Gromyko, his foreign minister. Gromyko said, "No, what, war?" And Khrushchev said, "No, not war, just basically teach these Americans about their arrogance. They have missiles in Turkey. We're going to put missiles in Cuba. Nothing about war." But of course, everything immediately spiraled out of control when the missile placements were discovered and the subterfuge that the Soviets were using to place the missile systems in place. And it was like the subterfuge of the United States doing what it did on its side. Things get out of hand. And as soon as Kennedy saw the U-2 spy plane over Cuba taking these pictures of missile sites, he convened an executive committee, ExCom, and it was almost unanimous. Well, we got to shoot down these sites. We have to take them out before they can be deployed. And it was unanimous, essentially, that there needed to be an immediate war. And the Joint Chiefs were told to go off and plan the military campaign against Cuba. Would it be an air campaign? Would it just be to take out the sites? How many troops would be needed, and so forth? Kennedy, interestingly, to make a very long story short, had lunch by coincidence with Adlai Stevenson, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, on the first day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy had seen the pictures. And Adlai Stevenson said to Kennedy, "Well, of course you need diplomacy to end this, and exchange the missiles with the Turkish missiles." Kennedy was shocked because no other advisor had said anything about diplomacy. It was basically unanimous for a military approach, which, by the way, almost surely may be too strong, although I'm not sure it is, but most likely would have led to nuclear annihilation, because our doctrine was that if we were attacked by a nuclear weapon, we would give a full response. By the way, full meaning not only the Soviet Union, but Eastern and Central Europe, China, hundreds of millions of people killed. And now we learned afterwards from the nuclear winter, maybe all of humanity perishing from starvation afterwards. But Stevenson laid the idea of maybe a negotiated settlement. Well, to make a long story short, as people know, Kennedy really almost alone, though with this hint from Stevenson, and then with his brother Robert pushing, and Ted Sorensen pushing, and a few others pushing, turned the tide over a few days that don't do something precipitous. Let's try to figure out what's in Khrushchev's mind. And Kennedy came to realize, because he had people like the Air Force head, Curtis LeMay, who just wanted nuclear war, it seems, or a first strike against the Soviet Union, that he was surrounded by a lot of hotheads who could end the world. And he realized Khrushchev probably was as well. And the two of them came to realize, we better tamp this down. And they did. And they agreed on a deal of this removal of missiles, both from Cuba and from Turkey. The big mistake Kennedy made, and I always think it's unfair to call it a mistake because he saved the world, so you get a lot of credit for that. But the mistake he made was insisting that the deal be secret, so that it looked to the American people like he had simply faced down the Soviet Union and they had backed away, because it wasn't known that the removal of the American missiles were part of an exchange. And that wasn't known for decades, actually.
So let's talk about how Kennedy changed and what he set out to do. And of course, it was all cut short by his assassination in November of 1963.
I think first it's fair to say that being president of the United States is a tough job. And it's impossible to do right in the early days and early years because you don't get it. and our security state in the United States, which was created by the National Security Act of 1947, which created a secret security state and a private army of the United States called the CIA, which is one half its function because it does intelligence and it does private warfare of the United States. And the whole apparatus is secret and largely out of control. And it is absolutely out of control by any public understanding or scrutiny or accountability or congressional oversight today as it was in the early 1960s. Well, Kennedy came in with a lot of energy and idealism and brilliance, and he stumbled terribly in the first year with the Bay of Pigs, Cuban invasion, and then in the second year, the near disaster of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And my view is he had the potential for greatness at the beginning, and by his third year, he had become a magnificent politician and statesman of the first order, one of our truly great presidents. Not so much in the first 2 years, although the potential was there, but the growth that came through this set of trials was extraordinary. Already after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy was so disturbed by the CIA that he was beside himself about how they had led the U.S. and his administration and himself personally into this awful debacle. He didn't trust the CIA. After the Cuban Missile Crisis and after hearing people like Curtis LeMay even essentially calling Kennedy a traitor for not launching the war or a coward, and feeling all of this pressure for war, he was profoundly disturbed and profoundly moved and profoundly scared at how fragile the world was. And he was determined to do something in 1963. And he
Let me just interject. He fired Dulles and he fired Bissell. So he actually took on the CIA establishment and triggered deep animus. And I want you, as you go on, to talk about this speech. But one of the things I found fascinating from your book is how few people he informed about what it was he was about to say. And so I want to make sure we talk about the content of what he said.
So Kennedy wanted to say to the American people, peace is possible, even with the Soviet Union, even with the other side. And the whole content of the speech is they are human beings like we are. They want to live. They want to protect their children. They want to have a future. And this speech is unbelievable because it's the only foreign policy speech I know of anywhere where it is not telling the other side what to do, not making threats, not reveling in glory, not saying we are number one, not saying they are evil, but saying to the American people, we need to reconsider our own position. And remember, today we're told every day by the completely irresponsible, reckless, and ignorant mass media like the New York Times, I'm going to say, because it's terrible, and like the Washington Post and others, there's no one to talk to. There's no one to negotiate with over Ukraine. And in the Cold War in 1963, it was even more like that. The Cuban Missile Crisis had just occurred. Could you even imagine negotiating with the Soviet Union? And Kennedy's whole message is, we can negotiate. They want the same things. They too will abide by treaties as long as those treaties are also in their interest. And they can be relied upon to abide by treaties that are in their interest and also in our interest. There is a benefit of cooperation. This is rational. In fact, the pursuit of peace is the rational end of rational men, says President Kennedy.
I just want to read a couple sections because it is an absolutely remarkable, and as you point out, through Sorensen, beautifully elegiac and just gorgeously written. But these are some of the things. I just want to read 3 short sections. I speak of peace, this is Kennedy, as the necessary rational end of rational men. I realize that the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war. And frequently the words of the pursuer fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. And then he says, so let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. And just to conclude, he asks in the speech, what kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children, not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women, not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. This is incredible.
It gives you goosebumps. Of course, I've listened, I don't know how many dozens or hundreds of times to the speech. I've made my family listen on so many occasions. But the words are thrilling. The words are mesmerizing in their beauty, and Ted Sorensen has a big hand in that as well. And in their ability to make change. And I think one of the things that Kennedy also says in here, which is incredible, is his advice on leadership. And I don't have exactly the words here, but to paraphrase, he says, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. So the goal of peace, if made to be manageable, practical, like a treaty to stop atomic testing stop atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, is a practical, manageable step, and people draw hope from it. So the speech was so riveting and powerful. By the way, kept completely outside of the bureaucracy. It was essentially hidden from the security apparatus, from the State Department, the CIA, even the White House. Only Sorensen and Kennedy worked on it basically until the last moment. Then they said, I'm giving this. Kennedy said, I'm giving it. So it could not be vetoed by state or by the Defense Department or the National Security Council or anybody else. And he gave it. And what is amazing, absolutely amazing, is that Khrushchev heard it, was carried away, summoned the U.S. envoy, Kennedy's envoy, to Moscow, Averell Harriman, and said, this is the finest speech by an American president since FDR. I want to make peace with your president. The words were so powerful. The motivation, the ideas were so powerful. Kennedy disseminated the speech through Pravda, Izvestia, online.
Isn't that hilarious? Pravda reprinted it.
Exactly, and broadcast the speech. And within a few weeks, they had signed the agreement. Within a few weeks. Absolutely an astounding achievement. Then Kennedy, just to say, he was also the grassroots politician. He was a political guy to the core. He went out to campaign for it. And so he took his tour around the United States. The Joint Chiefs, oh, well, we don't know. They come to testify in Congress and try to knock down this agreement. And Kennedy carried the American public overwhelmingly, and then won a decisive victory in the Senate 60 years ago, just now, for the ratification of this treaty. And this is the time when we're talking is the time of the UN General Assembly. Kennedy went to tell the leaders what this meant in another completely magnificent address. And he said, this is not the end of conflict, but it is a ray of hope piercing through the clouds. And he ends his address to the world leaders assembled in front of him in the chamber of the UN General Assembly. Kennedy, having brought peace, brought hope, and all the world leaders assembled in front of him. And he says to them that Archimedes is said to have told his friends, "Give me a place to stand and I can move the world." Fellow leaders of the world, let us see if we can take our stand here in this place, in this time, to move the world towards peace. And you just can't get better than that. The idealism, the hope, the practicality, and Kennedy infused the whole world with it. And then they killed him.
And we've lost it. We've lost it.
And they killed him because I'm personally convinced, after having studied this in depth for decades now, and now we have the report completely debunking the Warren Commission with the magic bullet being no magic bullet at all, but a bullet that the Secret Service pulled out of the back of Kennedy's seat and put on the stretcher, debunking the entire forensic basis of the Warren Commission. I'm pretty convinced that it was rogue elements within the U.S. government itself.
Well, Alan Dulles.
Alan Dulles,
Can't
CIA.
get more evil. Can't get more evil than that.
Exactly. We don't know exactly who, but this was a conspiracy, and it was a conspiracy against peace. And it's our security state is in full force. Our president, in my view, is not in control, and in any event has been a hardliner and a Cold Warrior, whatever you want to call it, well past the Cold War. These neocons don't understand peace. They don't understand negotiation. They don't understand diplomacy. They don't understand the nuclear threat. And one other point, Chris, of the speech that I think is so pertinent and completely neglected, Kennedy says, above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. And the U.S. has gone out to humiliate Putin and to defeat Putin. And Russia has 6,000 nuclear weapons. What are we doing? What are we thinking? Of course, I take it a little bit, even a step back. I think this is, I call it the war of NATO enlargement, because I think the entire war in Ukraine came because the United States so recklessly and imprudently kept pushing NATO enlargement. Russia saying, stop. It's a red line. Stop. And then not to Ukraine, for heaven's sake, not to Ukraine, our 2,300 kilometer border, not to surround us in the Black Sea. And the U.S. is deaf to this. And then trying to humiliate Putin and doing exactly the opposite of what Kennedy said. And I take it seriously when Kennedy says in that remark about not pushing a nuclear power to a corner, he says, above all, as if that's the synthesis of what he's learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Above all, don't humiliate a nuclear adversary. And our people don't even know it. We don't have diplomats, and we don't have a president, in my view, that understands the job of keeping the foot on the brake. So it's a very dangerous time.